The mournful whistle of the afternoon train echoed across the dusty plains of Promise Creek, Colorado, in 1878. But Lillian Barton barely registered the sound as tears streamed down her face, dampening the black mourning dress that hung from her thin frame. The harsh summer sun beat down relentlessly on the depot platform, but Lillian felt nothing but the cold emptiness that had consumed her since burying her husband 3 days prior. Exhaustion had finally overwhelmed her, forcing her to settle on the weathered wooden bench outside the depot. Her trunk sat beside her, containing all that remained of her life in Promise Creek. The life she had built with Thomas over 8 years of marriage, now reduced to a few possessions that would accompany her back east to a sister she barely knew anymore. The sound of spurs jingling against wooden planks barely registered until a deep voice spoke from beside her. "Madam, forgive my intrusion, but no one should cry alone on a day like this." Lillian looked up through tear-blurred vision to see a tall figure lowering himself onto the bench beside her. As she wiped her eyes with a handkerchief that had long since become damp, the man's features came into focus. Sun-bronzed skin stretched over high cheekbones, and kind eyes the color of a summer storm gazed at her from beneath the brim of a well-worn hat. "I'm afraid I'm poor company today, sir," Lillian managed, her voice rough from hours of sobbing. "Name's Henry Vance, madam," he said, removing his hat and revealing hair the color of wheat touched by sun. "And sometimes the best company is the kind that asks for nothing in return." He offered her a clean handkerchief, and Lillian hesitated before accepting it. "Thank you, Mr. Vance." "I'm Lillian Barton," she dabbed at her eyes. "Though I suppose I should get accustomed to being called Widow Barton now." Henry's eyes softened with understanding. "Recent loss," Lillian nodded, fresh tears threatening. "My husband Thomas, 3 days ago, pneumonia." The words came out stilted, each one a wound reopened. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that, Mrs. Barton." They sat in silence for several moments, the distant sounds of the town providing a backdrop to Lillian's grief. The train wouldn't arrive for another hour, and she dreaded the long journey ahead, returning to Philadelphia defeated and alone. "Where you headed?" Henry asked, his voice gentle as the breeze that occasionally stirred the stifling air. "Philadelphia. My sister lives there." Lillian folded the borrowed handkerchief in her lap. "There's nothing left for me here." Henry studied her profile, noting the delicate curve of her jaw and the strength hidden beneath her sorrow. "Sometimes what's ahead of us isn't clear until we've weathered the storm." Lillian turned to look at him fully for the first time. His face bore the lines of a man who'd seen his share of hardship, yet his eyes held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "And what storms have you weathered, Mr. Vance?" A small smile touched his lips. "Enough to know that even the darkest clouds eventually pass." The depot door swung open, and the station master stepped out, checking his pocket watch. "Train's running about 30 minutes late, folks. Telegraph just came through." Lillian sighed, twisting her wedding band around her finger. "More time to sit with my misery, I suppose. Or more time to consider alternatives," Henry said. "Alternatives? There are no alternatives. I have no home, no means to support myself here." Henry leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Mrs. Barton, I own a cattle ranch about 10 miles outside of town. The Silver Creek Ranch. It's not much to look at, but it's mine, free and clear." Lillian stared at him, confusion creasing her brow. "I don't understand what that has to do with me. I need help, someone to cook, keep house." "The pay isn't much, but you'd have a roof over your head and honest work." He hesitated, then added, "It wouldn't be charity. I truly need the help." Lillian's spine stiffened. "Mr. Vance, we've only just met." "I couldn't possibly. I'm not asking anything improper, madam," Henry interrupted, his expression earnest. "I've got a small cabin on the property where you could stay, complete privacy. And if after a month you still want to head east, I'll personally pay for your ticket." Lillian's mind raced. The thought of returning to Philadelphia, to a sister who had made it clear in her letters that Lillian's presence would be tolerated rather than welcomed, filled her with dread. Yet the alternative, staying in this place of heartbreak, working for a stranger, seemed equally daunting. "Why would you offer this to someone you don't know?" she asked, suspicion edging her voice. Henry's gaze was steady. Because 8 years ago I was sitting where you are now, lost everything in a firewife child home. A stranger gave me work when I had nothing. Sometimes that's all a person needs, a chance to find their feet again. The honesty in his voice struck her. Lillian looked down at her wedding band, then at her trunk. Thomas had always encouraged her independent spirit, even when others in town had deemed it inappropriate. What would he want for her now? I don't know the first thing about ranch life, she admitted. Can you cook? Yes. Can you read and write? Of course. Are you afraid of hard work? Lillian almost smiled despite herself. No, Mr. Vance, I'm not afraid of hard work, Henry nodded. Then you know enough to start. He stood up, offering his hand. I can't promise you an easy life, Mrs. Barton, but I can promise you won't face it alone, not while you're with me. Lillian looked at his outstretched hand, then at the train tracks stretching eastward. The life she had planned was gone, swept away by illness and death. Perhaps it was time to consider a new path, however uncertain it might be. 1 month, she said finally, placing her gloved hand in his. And if I wish to leave after that time, you'll honor your word. You have it, Henry said, his grip firm and reassuring. Forever with me, or for as long as you choose to stay, the decision will always be yours. As the words left his mouth, he seemed almost surprised by them, as if he hadn't intended to phrase it quite that way, but he didn't retract them. Lillian stood, smoothing her black skirts. Very well, Mr. Vance, it seems I won't be taking the train today after all. For the first time in days, Lillian felt something other than crushing grief. It wasn't hope, not exactly, she wasn't ready for hope yet. But it was possibility, and for now, that would have to be enough. Henry lifted her trunk with ease, setting it in the back of his wagon. As he helped Lillian onto the seat, the station master emerged again. Mrs. Barton, your train will be here in 20 minutes. Shall I see to your trunk? Lillian exchanged a glance with Henry before responding. No thank you, Mr. Patterson. My plans have changed. Patterson's eyebrows rose as he looked between Lillian and Henry, but he merely nodded and retreated into the station. People will talk, Lillian said quietly as Henry climbed up beside her. People always do, he replied, taking up the reins. But out here, folks generally mind their own business, and those who don't aren't worth fretting over. As the wagon pulled away from the depot, Lillian cast one last glance at the bench where her life had taken an unexpected turn. She didn't know what awaited her at Silver Creek Ranch, but for the first time since Thomas had drawn his last breath, she felt as though she might survive this grief. The road out of Promise Creek wound through rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers that swayed in the afternoon breeze. Henry kept a respectful distance on the wagon seat, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing brief anecdotes about the area. Lillian appreciated his attempt to distract her, though her responses remained minimal. That's the McCullen place, Henry said, nodding toward a modest homestead nestled against a stand of cottonwoods. Jim and Sarah, good folks. Their youngest, Nathan, works for me sometimes during calving season. Lillian nodded, watching as a woman emerged from the cabin to hang laundry on a line. The simple domesticity of the scene sent a pang through her heart. Just a week ago, she had been performing similar tasks, unaware that her world was about to crumble. How much farther? She asked, suddenly weary. Another hour or so, Henry replied. We'll stop to rest the horses at the creek up ahead. True to his word, Henry halted the wagon beside a clear-running stream half an hour later. He helped Lillian down, then unhitched the horses to let them drink. Lillian walked a few paces away, stretching her legs and taking in the vastness of the landscape. The endless sky arched overhead, a brilliant blue that seemed to go on forever. Despite her grief, she couldn't help but be moved by the wild beauty surrounding her. It's something, isn't it? Henry said, coming to stand beside her, though still maintaining a respectful distance. First time I saw this land, I knew I'd found home. How long have you been here? Lillian asked. Bought the ranch 7 years ago, but I've been in Colorado since '65, right after the war. You fought. Henry nodded, his expression growing distant. Union cavalry, saw things no man should see. He shook his head slightly, as if dispelling unwanted memories. But that's long past now. Lillian studied him with new interest. This man had layers she hadn't expected, and your ranch, you run it alone. Got a few hands that help with the cattle. Josiah Parker's been with me longest, about 5 years now. Good man, if a bit rough around the edges. Then there's Illy Thornton, young fellow learning the ropes, and Miguel Reyes handles the horses, best horseman I've ever known. Henry smiled slightly. They live in the bunkhouse, keep to themselves mostly. And the cabin you mentioned for me, it was meant to be a place for the foreman, but I never hired one. It's small but solid, about a quarter mile from the main house, so you'll have your privacy. Lillian nodded, surprisingly comforted by the thought. I appreciate that, Mr. Vance, Henry, he corrected gently. If we're going to be working together, might as well use my given name. After a moment's hesitation, Lillian nodded. Very well, Henry, and you may call me Lillian. A genuine smile crossed his face, transforming his features and revealing a dimple in his right cheek. Lillian it is, then. They continued their journey in a more comfortable silence. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the wagon crested a hill, and Silver Creek Ranch came into view below them. The main house was larger than Lillian had expected, a 2-story structure built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around the front. A barn stood nearby, along with several corrals and outbuildings. To the east, a smaller cabin was visible, situated near a grove of aspen trees. A creek, presumably Silver Creek, wound through the property, reflecting the late afternoon sunlight. It's beautiful, Lillian said softly, genuinely impressed. Henry's expression was a mixture of pride and something more vulnerable. Built most of it myself. The main house took 3 years to finish. You've accomplished a great deal. Had a lot to prove, I suppose. He clicked to the horses, guiding them down the slope toward home. Mostly to myself. As they approached the ranch, a tall, lanky man emerged from the barn, raising a hand in greeting. Henry returned the gesture. That's Josiah, he explained. I'll introduce you properly once we get you settled. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the main house, and Josiah ambled over, his curious gaze taking in Lillian. Afternoon, boss, he said, then touched the brim of his hat. Madam. Josiah, this is Mrs. Lillian Barton, Henry said as he climbed down from the wagon. She'll be staying in the foreman's cabin and helping with the house. If Josiah was surprised, he hid it well. Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Barton. We sure could use some civilizing influence around here. Thank you, Mr. Parker, Lillian replied, accepting Henry's hand to help her down from the wagon. I look forward to getting acquainted. Josiah, would you mind seeing to the horses? Henry asked. I'll show Mrs. Barton to the cabin. Sure thing, boss. Josiah began unhitching the team, casting occasional curious glances their way. Henry retrieved Lillian's trunk and led her toward the smaller cabin. As they walked, 2 more men appeared from the bunkhouse, one young with sandy hair, the other older with dark features and a mustache. That's Illy and Miguel, Henry explained. You'll meet them at supper. The foreman's cabin was simple but well built, with a small porch facing the creek. Inside, it consisted of one main room with a cast iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner. A curtain partitioned off a small area that contained a washstand and a chest of drawers. It's not much, Henry said, setting down her trunk, but it's clean, the roof doesn't leak, and the stove works well. Lillian surveyed what would be her home for at least the next month. After the initial shock of her impulsive decision had worn off during the journey, doubt had begun to creep in. Now, standing in this simple cabin, far from everything familiar, she felt a wave of uncertainty. Henry seemed to sense her distress. I know it's a big change, he said gently. And if you decide tomorrow that you want to catch the train east after all, I'll take you back to town myself. No hard feelings. His understanding nearly undid her. Lillian pressed her lips together, fighting back tears. No, she said finally. I made my choice. I'll stay for the month at least, as we agreed. Henry nodded, respect evident in his gaze. Well then, I'll leave you to get settled. Supper's at 6 in the main house. Nothing fancy, the men take turns cooking, and it's Illy's night, so. He grimaced slightly, then smiled. Let's just say we could really use your help in that department. Despite everything, Lillian found herself returning his smile. I'll be there. After Henry left, Lillian sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to release the breath she felt she'd been holding all day. What had she done? Agreeing to live and work on the ranch of a man she'd just met. It defied all propriety, all common sense. Yet as she glanced around her cabin, at least for now, she felt an unexpected flicker of something that might have been relief. Here, miles from Promise Creek, she wouldn't have to endure the pitying glances of neighbors or face the empty rooms of the home she'd shared with Thomas. Perhaps Henry Vance had been right. Perhaps what she needed most right now was not to run from her grief, but to find a new purpose while she weathered it. With renewed determination, Lillian stood and began to unpack her trunk. 1 month. She would give herself 1 month to see if there might be a place for her here, in this wild, beautiful land that had already taken so much from her, but might yet have something to give. The first few days at Silver Creek Ranch passed in a blur of adjustment for Lillian. She rose with the sun, prepared breakfast for Henry and the ranch hands, then spent her days cleaning the main house, which had clearly lacked a woman's touch for years. Dust had settled into every crevice, and the kitchen was woefully disorganized, but Lillian found a strange comfort in the physical labor, which left her too exhausted at night to lie awake with her grief. Henry kept his distance, seemingly intent on proving that his offer had been genuine and without ulterior motive. He was unfailingly polite, thanking her for each meal and making sure she had everything she needed, but he never lingered in her company longer than necessary. On her 4th morning at the ranch, Lillian arrived at the main house earlier than usual, hoping to try her hand at biscuits in the temperamental oven before the men arrived for breakfast. To her surprise, Henry was already in the kitchen, coffee brewing on the stove. "You're up early," she commented, setting down her basket of supplies. Henry turned, a flash of something pleasure, crossing his face before his expression settled into its usual calm. "Cattle business doesn't much care for sleeping in." He gestured to the coffee pot. "Just made a fresh pot if you'd like some." "Thank you." Lillian accepted the cup he offered, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. She ignored the unexpected flutter in her stomach at the contact. "I thought I'd try biscuits this morning, if that's all right." "More than all right," Henry replied with a smile. "The men will think they've died and gone to heaven. Ellie's attempts at biscuits are better suited for horseshoes than eating." Lillian laughed, the sound surprising her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed before Thomas fell ill, certainly. Henry's expression softened as he watched her. "It's good to hear you laugh." Lillian busied herself with gathering ingredients, uncomfortable with the moment of vulnerability. "Yes, well, I should get started if these are to be ready when the men come in." Henry nodded, seeming to understand her need to retreat behind the formality of their arrangement. "I'll be out checking the north pasture today with Josiah. We've had some trouble with coyotes going after the calves." "Will you be back for supper?" "Planning on it," he confirmed, finishing his coffee. "Don't wait if we're late, though." After he left, Lillian found herself listening to the sound of his boots on the porch steps, the jingle of his spurs growing fainter as he walked away. She shook her head at her foolishness and focused on mixing the biscuit dough, deliberately pushing all thoughts of Henry Vance's kind eyes and gentle manner from her mind. The biscuits were a resounding success, earning her enthusiastic praise from the ranch hands. Illy, a young man of perhaps 20 with an earnest face full of freckles, declared them the best he'd ever tasted. Miguel, more reserved but equally appreciative, thanked her in both English and Spanish. Josiah, who had initially regarded her with polite wariness, seemed to warm to her presence after sampling her cooking. "Boss sure knew what he was doing, bringing you here," he commented as he helped himself to a 3rd biscuit. "We've been eating our own cooking for too long." "It's the least I can do in exchange for Mr. Vance's kindness," Lillian replied, refilling coffee cups. "Henry's a good man," Josiah said, his tone serious. "Best I've ever worked for, treats a man fair, pays on time, doesn't ask anything of others he wouldn't do himself." Lillian nodded, sensing that Josiah was trying to tell her something important. "He seems to be." "He's had his share of hardship," Josiah continued, lowering his voice so the others couldn't hear. Lost his family some years back, doesn't talk about it much, but it changed him. He mentioned a fire, Lillian said cautiously. Josiah nodded. Happened back in Kansas. Henry was away driving cattle to market, came home to nothing but ashes. He shook his head. Lesser man might have broken, but Henry just got quieter, worked harder, built all this. He gestured to encompass the ranch. Never saw him take much interest in his own comfort before. This place was functional, but that was about it until you came along. Before Lillian could respond, Ellie called Josiah's name from the doorway. Boss says we're burning daylight. Josiah stood, tipping his hat to Lillian. Just thought you should know, he said, then followed Ellie outside. Lillian remained at the table, turning Josiah's words over in her mind. So Henry had lost his family in a fire while he was away. The knowledge filled in some of the shadows she'd sensed in him, explaining the deep understanding he'd shown for her grief. With a sigh, she began clearing the breakfast dishes. It wouldn't do to dwell too much on Henry Vance's past or to draw too many parallels between his losses and her own. She was here to work, to earn her keep until she decided what her future would hold. Nothing more. But as she went about her tasks that day, scrubbing the long, neglected floors, airing out linens, organizing the pantry, Lillian found her thoughts repeatedly drifting to the ranch owner. His quiet strength, the gentle way he spoke to her, the respect he showed for her grief. It had been a long time since anyone had treated her as something other than Thomas Barton's wife. By late afternoon, Lillian had worked herself into a state of physical exhaustion but mental restlessness. Seeking fresh air, she decided to explore the immediate surroundings of the ranch. The day was pleasantly warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers from the nearby meadow. She followed the path of Silver Creek as it wound through the property, admiring the way the sunlight dappled the water through overhanging trees. About a quarter-mile from the main house, she discovered a small clearing beside the creek, where someone had placed a rough-hewn bench overlooking the water. Lillian sat, grateful for the moment of peace. The rushing sound of the creek was soothing, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt her tightly wound nerves begin to uncoil. Closing her eyes, she allowed herself to simply breathe, to exist in this moment without the weight of the past or the uncertainty of the future pressing down on her. It's my favorite spot on the whole ranch. Lillian's eyes flew open. Henry stood a few paces away, leading his horse by the reins. His clothes were dusty from the day's work, and a sheen of sweat glistened on his brow, but his expression was serene as he gazed at the creek. I didn't mean to intrude, Lillian said, starting to rise. You're not, Henry assured her. I just stopped to let Thunder drink before heading back to the barn. He nodded toward his horse, a powerful black gelding now lowering his head to the creek. It's beautiful here, Lillian said, settling back onto the bench. So peaceful, Henry nodded. Built that bench the first summer I was here. Used to come sit of an evening planning what I wanted the ranch to become. A small smile touched his lips. Had big dreams back then, and have they come true, your dreams? Henry considered the question, absently stroking Thunder's neck as the horse drank. Some have. Ranch is doing well enough, got good men working for me, land's productive. He paused. But a man's dreams change as he gets older. Things that seemed important once don't matter so much anymore. And what matters to you now? Lillian asked, surprising herself with the personal nature of the question. Henry's gaze met hers, steady and unflinching. Peace, purpose, good company. He smiled slightly. Simple things, I suppose. The honesty in his voice touched something in Lillian. I don't think those things are simple at all, she said softly. In fact, they might be the most difficult to find. A moment of understanding passed between them, a recognition of shared experience that transcended the brief time they'd known each other. Thunder lifted his head, water dripping from his muzzle, breaking the moment. Henry cleared his throat. I should get him back to the barn. Miguel will have my hide if I don't tend to him properly. Lillian nodded. And I should start supper. Will you be all right finding your way back? Yes, it's not far. I'll be along shortly. Henry hesitated, then nodded. Take your time. This place has a way of healing what ails a person if you let it. As he led Thunder away, Lillian watched his retreating figure, struck by the easy grace with which he moved despite his tall frame. There was something reassuring about Henry Vance, a steadiness that made her feel secure in his presence. Dangerous thoughts for a woman still raw with grief, still wearing another man's ring. Lillian twisted her wedding band, a habit she'd developed since Thomas's death. The simple gold circle had come to represent not just her marriage, but the life she'd expected to live, a life now forever close to her. With a sigh, she rose from the bench. She had committed to 1 month at Silver Creek Ranch, and barely a week had passed. There was time enough to sort through her confused feelings, to determine what path her future should take. For now, she had supper to prepare and work to do, tangible tasks to occupy her hands while her heart and mind healed. As she walked back toward the main house, Lillian found herself looking forward to the evening meal, to the simple pleasure of providing nourishment for others. It wasn't much, but it was purpose, and for now, that would have to be enough. The days began to settle into a comfortable rhythm for Lillian. Mornings were devoted to breakfast preparation and cleanup, followed by whatever household tasks needed attention. Afternoons often found her working in the small vegetable garden behind the main house, which had been sadly neglected until her arrival. The rich soil responded eagerly to her attention, and soon tender shoots of radishes, lettuce, and carrots began to emerge. Henry made a point of checking in with her daily, usually in the evening after the day's work was done. Their conversations remained largely practical discussions about meals, supplies needed from town, ranch matters that might affect her routine, but Lillian found herself looking forward to these brief interactions with an eagerness that both confused and alarmed her. 2 weeks after her arrival at Silver Creek, Henry approached her as she was hanging laundry behind her cabin. "Got to ride into Promise Creek tomorrow for supplies," he said, helping her secure a sheet that threatened to blow away in the breeze. "Thought you might want to come along. Could be good for you to get off the ranch for a spell." Lillian hesitated. The thought of returning to Promise Creek, of facing the pitying glances and whispered comments, made her stomach knot with anxiety. Yet she couldn't avoid the town forever, especially if she decided to stay beyond the month they'd agreed upon, a possibility she found herself considering more frequently as the days passed. "Yes," she said finally. "I think that would be wise. There are a few things I could use." Henry nodded, seemingly pleased by her acceptance. "We'll leave after breakfast then, should be back before sundown." The next morning dawned clear and mild, perfect for the journey to town. Lillian dressed with care in one of her simpler dresses, not the full morning black she'd worn at the depot, but a navy blue that acknowledged her widowhood while being practical for travel. Henry was waiting by the wagon when she emerged from her cabin, and something in his expression as he looked at her made Lillian's cheeks warm. "You look nice," he said simply, offering his hand to help her up to the seat. "Thank you," she replied, settling her skirts around her. It seemed time to set aside the deepest mourning. Henry nodded, understanding in his eyes as he climbed up beside her. "Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting," he said quietly, "just means you're still living." The journey to Promise Creek took most of the morning, filled with comfortable conversation about the ranch and the surrounding countryside. Henry pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area's history, his deep voice painting vivid pictures of the land before settlements had tamed it. As they approached the outskirts of town, however, Lillian fell silent, anxiety tightening her chest. Henry seemed to sense her discomfort. "We don't have to stay long," he assured her. "Just long enough to collect supplies and handle any business you might have." Lillian nodded gratefully. "I should visit the bank, and perhaps the mercantile for some fabric. The curtains in the main house are practically disintegrating." "Whatever you need," Henry said. "The ranch account at Wallace's mercantile will cover it." Promise Creek looked much as it had when Lillian had left it, though somehow smaller and less significant than it had seemed during the 8 years she'd called it home. Main Street was busy with the usual traffic, wagons, riders, and pedestrians going about their daily business. Henry pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the mercantile. I'll see to the feed and seed order first, then meet you here in about an hour, unless you'd prefer company. No, that's fine, Lillian said, appreciating his sensitivity. I can manage. As she expected, her appearance in town caused a stir of whispered conversations and curious glances. Lillian held her head high as she made her way to the bank, refusing to be cowed by the speculation she knew was following her. Inside the bank, Mr. Leighton, the manager, greeted her with exaggerated sympathy. Mrs. Barton, how unexpected to see you. We'd heard you'd left town. Not exactly, Mr. Leighton. I've taken a position at Silver Creek Ranch. Leighton's eyebrows rose. I see. Well, how may we assist you today? I'd like to withdraw a small amount from my account, and I need to discuss the status of the outstanding loan on my husband's shop. The transaction was straightforward enough, though Lillian couldn't help noticing the teller's curious glances. By the time she left the bank, she felt emotionally drained, but determined to complete her errands with dignity. At Wallace's Mercantile, she selected fabric for new curtains, along with thread and a few personal items she needed. Mrs. Wallace, a plump woman with kind eyes and a notorious fondness for gossip, rang up her purchases. "Staying out at the Vance place, are you?" she asked, measuring out yard goods with practiced hands. "Yes, I'm helping with the household," Lillian replied evenly. Mrs. Wallace nodded. "Henry Vance is a good man, quiet sort, keeps to himself mostly, but fair in his dealings." She leaned forward slightly. "Lost his family some years back, you know, wife and little girl, terrible tragedy." Lillian merely nodded, unwilling to engage in gossip about Henry, even if part of her was curious to know more about his past. "Town was right surprised when he didn't bring you back on the next train," Mrs. Wallace continued, undeterred by Lillian's reticence. "Quite the topic of conversation it was, still is, I suppose." She gave Lillian a knowing look. "People will talk, of course." "People often talk about matters that don't concern them," Lillian said coolly. "I've found it best not to trouble myself over it, Mrs. Wallace had the grace to look abashed. "No offense meant, Mrs. Barton, just making conversation." "Of course," Lillian replied, forcing a polite smile. "Could you add these items to the Silver Creek Ranch account, please?" By the time she emerged from the Mercantile, arms laden with packages, Lillian was exhausted from the effort of maintaining her composure. The sight of Henry waiting by the wagon, his tall figure unmistakable even from a distance, filled her with unexpected relief. He hurried to help her with her purchases. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly, searching her face. "Yes, just tired of being the subject of town gossip," Lillian admitted. Henry's expression hardened slightly. "Anyone say something to upset you?" "No, nothing like that, just..." Curious glances, pointed questions. She sighed. "It's to be expected, I suppose." Henry helped her into the wagon with gentle hands. "People will find something new to gossip about soon enough," he said as he climbed up beside her. "Until then, let them talk. We know the truth of matters." The simple "we" in his statement warmed Lillian in a way she wasn't prepared for. It had been so long since she'd felt part of any "we" besides her marriage to Thomas. Their return journey was quieter, both lost in their own thoughts as the wagon rolled through the afternoon sunshine. About halfway back to the ranch, Henry pulled the wagon to a stop beside a small stream to rest the horses. "Hungry?" he asked, reaching behind the seat to produce a cloth-wrapped package. "Mrs. Wallace insisted I take this when I mentioned we'd be traveling through the noon hour." Inside the package was a simple but hearty meal of bread, cheese, and cold chicken. They ate sitting on a fallen log beside the stream, the horses grazing contentedly nearby. "Thank you for today," Lillian said after they'd eaten in companionable silence for a while, "for accompanying me to town." Henry shrugged, "Needed supplies anyway. Still, it was easier having you there." He looked at her then, his gray eyes serious. "You're part of Silver Creek now, Lillian, means you don't face things alone anymore." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. "I'm only committed to the month we agreed upon," she reminded him, though the words lacked conviction even to her own ears. "True enough," Henry acknowledged, "but my statement stands regardless of how long you choose to stay." Lillian looked down at her hands, at the wedding ring that still encircled her finger. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," she admitted softly. Every plan I had, every expectation for my future died with Thomas. I feel adrift. Henry was quiet for a long moment before responding. After I lost my family, I spent nearly 2 years wandering. Took whatever work I could find, never stayed anywhere longer than a few months. He gazed out at the rolling hills surrounding them. Wasn't until I saw this land that something inside me settled, like a compass needle finding north. He turned to look at her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. I can't tell you what your path should be, Lillian, but I can tell you that sometimes the life we find isn't the one we planned, but it might be the one we need. His words resonated deep within her, touching a truth Lillian had been afraid to acknowledge. Her life with Thomas was over, irrevocably and permanently. Whatever came next would be entirely different from what she had expected, but that didn't mean it couldn't be meaningful, even fulfilling. "We should head back," Henry said after a moment, collecting the remains of their meal. Still got a few hours of daylight left. As they continued their journey to Silver Creek, Lillian found herself studying Henry's profile against the backdrop of the endless Colorado sky. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet strength that she'd come to rely on more than she'd realized. The thought should have frightened her to be growing dependent on a man she'd known for such a short time. Yet somehow, it didn't. Instead, it felt like the first tentative step toward whatever her new life might become. The trip to Promise Creek marked a turning point for Lillian. Though she hadn't consciously made a decision about her future, she found herself settling more comfortably into life at Silver Creek, making small changes to the main house that transformed it from merely functional to genuinely homelike. New curtains brightened the windows, wildflowers in mason jars appeared on tables, and the lingering bachelor atmosphere gradually gave way to something more welcoming. Henry noticed the changes, but said little, though his appreciation was evident in the way his gaze lingered on the improvements she made. The ranch hands were more vocal in their approval, especially when Lillian's attention extended to the bunkhouse, where she insisted on replacing threadbare linens and adding proper curtains to the windows. "Place hasn't looked this good since." "Well, ever," Josiah commented one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "It just needed a woman's touch," Lillian replied, her hands busy with mending one of Henry's shirts. "Needed you specifically, I'd say," Henry said quietly from his position at the porch railing. Lillian glanced up, caught by the intensity in his gaze. Warmth spread through her at the simple compliment, and she found herself unable to look away from his eyes, which reflected the golden light of the setting sun. Josiah cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Well, I'd best check on that new calf before turning in," he said, rising from his chair with a knowing look between them. "Night, Mrs. Barton, boss." After he'd gone, a companionable silence settled between Lillian and Henry. She returned to her mending, aware of him watching her from the corner of her eye. "The month's almost up," Henry said finally, his voice carefully neutral, Lillian's hands stilled. She'd been aware of the passing time, of course, but hearing Henry acknowledge it aloud made it suddenly, undeniably real. In just 3 days, their agreement would come to an end, and she would need to decide whether to stay at Silver Creek or continue with her original plan to return east. "Yes, it is," she replied, equally neutral. Henry moved from the railing to sit in the chair Josiah had vacated, bringing him closer to Lillian. "Have you given any thought to what you'll do?" Lillian set aside her mending, buying time to gather her thoughts. The truth was, she'd thought of little else for days, weighing her options and examining her feelings with ruthless honesty. "I have," she said finally, meeting his gaze. "I'm just not certain yet what the right choice is." Henry nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "Fair enough. Just wanted you to know that the offer stands. Your position here at Silver Creek, for as long as you want it." The careful way he phrased it, "your position," reminded Lillian of the practical nature of their arrangement. Henry needed a housekeeper. She needed a place to stay and work to do. That was all this was. All it could be, with her still in mourning and Henry clearly respecting that fact. Yet something in his eyes, in the tension of his shoulders as he awaited her response, suggested there might be more to his offer than mere practicality. "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate that, and I promise I'll let you know my decision before the month is up." Henry seemed to relax slightly. "No rush," he said, though his tone belied the casualness of his words. "Just wanted you to know where things stand." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. It was a companionable silence, comfortable in a way Lillian wouldn't have thought possible with a man she'd known for such a short time. "I should turn in," she said eventually, gathering her mending. "Morning comes early." Henry rose as she did, ever the gentleman. "I'll walk you to your cabin." "There's no need, I know," he interrupted gently, "but I'd like to if you don't mind." Lillian hesitated, then nodded. "All right." "Thank you." The walk to her cabin was brief, just a few minutes along the path that wound past the barn and through a small grove of trees. They walked side by side, not touching but close enough that Lillian could feel the warmth of Henry's presence beside her in the cool evening air. At her door, they paused, an awkward moment hovering between them. "Thank you for the escort," Lillian said, suddenly shy. Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful in the moonlight. "Lillian," he began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Whatever you decide, I want you to know that having you here has. It's made a difference to the ranch, to the men," a pause, "to me." The simple admission delivered in his deep, steady voice touched something in Lillian's heart. "It's made a difference to me too," she admitted, "being here. Having purpose again." Henry's gaze held hers for a long moment, and Lillian felt something shift between them, a recognition of feelings neither was quite ready to name. "Good night, Lillian," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "Good night, Henry." She watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. Only when he was out of sight did Lillian enter her cabin, closing the door behind her with a sigh. The decision before her was more complicated than she'd initially imagined. Staying at Silver Creek meant not just continuing in her role as housekeeper, but also acknowledging the growing connection between herself and Henry Vance, a connection that both thrilled and terrified her. Leaving meant safety from those confusing feelings, a return to the predictable path of a respectable widow. Her sister's home in Philadelphia would offer security, if not warmth. She could build a quiet life there, honoring Thomas's memory without the complication of unexpected emotions for another man. Lillian readied herself for bed with mechanical movements, her mind churning with the choice before her. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, she found herself remembering Henry's words by the stream. "Sometimes the life we find isn't the one we planned, but it might be the one we need." Was Silver Creek the life she needed now? Was Henry? Sleep was long in coming that night, and when it did, Lillian's dreams were filled with images of endless skies, running water, and gray eyes that saw too much. The next morning brought an unexpected change to the routine of the ranch. Lillian was just placing biscuits in the oven when the sound of approaching horses drew her to the window. Henry and Josiah were riding in fast, followed by a wagon driven by a stranger, with what appeared to be an injured man lying in the back. Wiping her hands on her apron, Lillian hurried outside. "Lillian," Henry called as he dismounted, "need your help. Got a man hurt bad." She followed him to the wagon, where Josiah and the driver were carefully lifting a man who groaned in pain. Blood soaked through a makeshift bandage on his leg. "What happened?" Lillian asked, already moving toward the house to prepare for the injured man. "Stagecoach robbery about 10 miles north," Henry explained, helping to carry the wounded man. "This is James Foster, the driver. The passenger, Mr. Hamilton, took a bullet in the leg. The doctor in town's away delivering a baby up in the hills, won't be back until tomorrow at the earliest. Bring him into the house," Lillian directed, quickly assessing the situation. "The spare bedroom downstairs. I'll need hot water, clean linens, and my sewing kit." Within minutes, the injured passenger was settled on the bed in the spare room. Lillian cut away his blood-soaked trouser leg to reveal an ugly bullet wound high on his thigh. "Bullet went clean through," Henry said, examining the wound. That's something, at least. Lillian nodded, mentally cataloging what needed to be done. During her marriage to Thomas, she'd often assisted when injuries occurred at his carpentry shop, and she'd nursed him through his final illness. She was no stranger to tending wounds. I need to clean it thoroughly, then stitch it closed, she said, rolling up her sleeves. Henry, can you hold him still? This will hurt. Henry nodded, positioning himself to restrain the semi-conscious man. Foster's gone to fetch Ellie and Miguel. They're going to ride out to see if they can track the robbers. Lillian worked methodically, cleaning the wound with carbolic acid that made Hamilton writhe in pain despite his weakened state. When she was satisfied it was as clean as possible, she threaded a needle with catgut. Hold him tight now, she warned Henry, then began to stitch the entry wound closed with small, neat sutures. Hamilton groaned and tried to pull away, but Henry's strong hands kept him immobile. You're doing fine, Henry murmured to the injured man. Mrs. Barton knows what she's about. Just a bit more now. When she finished with both the entry and exit wounds, Lillian bandaged the leg securely, then mixed a dose of laudanum from the small medicine chest she'd brought from her previous home. This will help with the pain and let him rest, she explained as she administered the medicine to the now conscious but groggy Hamilton. He'll need to stay quiet for several days to avoid reopening the wound. Henry nodded, his expression a mixture of concern and admiration as he watched her work. I'll send word to Promise Creek about what happened. The sheriff will want to know. Once Hamilton had fallen into a drug-induced sleep, Lillian stepped outside with Henry to discuss the situation. He can stay here until he's well enough to travel, she said. I can tend to him along with my other duties. Henry studied her face, his gaze thoughtful. You're good at this, healing. Lillian shrugged slightly. I've had some experience with injuries, and I nursed Thomas through his illness. Still, not everyone would have the stomach for it, or the skill. Henry's voice was warm with admiration. Silver Creek is lucky to have you. The genuine appreciation in his tone brought a flush to Lillian's cheeks. Well, Mr. Hamilton is lucky you and Josiah happened along when you did. From the amount of blood he lost, he might not have survived much longer without help. Henry nodded grimly. Foster managed to get away with the stage after the shooting, but Hamilton was bleeding badly. We came across them on our way back from checking the North Range. They were interrupted by the return of Josiah, Illy, and Miguel, armed and ready to track the robbers. Sheriff's been notified, Josiah reported. He's gathering a posse but asked if we could start tracking while the trail's fresh. Henry turned to Lillian. Will you be all right here alone with Hamilton? I should go with them. Of course, she assured him. He'll sleep for hours with the laudanum I gave him. Go. Henry hesitated, his expression conflicted. If he takes a turn for the worse, I'll manage, Lillian said firmly. This isn't the first bullet wound I've treated, and I doubt it will be the last, living out here. Something flickered in Henry's eyes at her words, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure at her casual reference to remaining at Silver Creek, but he merely nodded. We'll be back as soon as we can. After the men rode out, Lillian returned to the house, checking on her patient before salvaging what she could of the breakfast she'd abandoned. Hamilton slept peacefully, his breathing regular, the bandage showing no fresh blood. A good sign. The day passed slowly, with Lillian dividing her time between her normal duties and checking on Hamilton. By late afternoon, he was awake and coherent enough to take some broth and express his gratitude. Mrs. Barton, is it? He asked, his voice weak but clear. The gentleman called you that, I think. Yes, Lillian Barton, she confirmed, adjusting his pillows to make him more comfortable. And you're Mr. Hamilton. You were shot during a stagecoach robbery. Hamilton nodded weakly. I remember, 2 men, faces covered. Didn't even ask for valuables, just started shooting, he grimaced. Foster got us away somehow. After that, things are a bit hazy until I woke up here. You're at Silver Creek Ranch, Lillian explained. Mr. Vance and his foreman found you and the driver on the road. They've gone with the others to track the robbers. Brave men, Hamilton murmured, and a brave woman from the look of this. He gestured to his bandaged leg. Not many ladies would have the courage to extract a bullet and stitch a wound. The bullet had already passed through, Lillian corrected. I just cleaned and stitched the wounds, and courage had little to do with it, just practical necessity. Hamilton smiled weakly. You remind me of my late wife, practical to a fault but with a kind heart beneath it all. Lillian returned his smile, finding something comforting in the comparison. You should rest now, Mr. Hamilton. Your body needs to heal. She had just settled him with another dose of laudanum when the sound of returning horses reached her. Hurrying to the window, she saw Henry and the others riding in, accompanied by the sheriff and 2 deputies. From their grim expressions, she guessed they hadn't caught the robbers. Stepping onto the porch, Lillian waited as the men dismounted. Henry approached her immediately, his face lined with fatigue and frustration. Trail went cold about 5 miles north of here, he explained. Looks like they had fresh horses waiting, sheriffs putting out word to watch for them. At least no one was killed, Lillian said softly. Henry nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. How's Hamilton? Awake earlier, took some broth. I've just given him more laudanum, so he'll sleep through the night now. The wound looks clean, no signs of infection yet. The sheriff, a weathered man named Dawson, joined them on the porch. Mrs. Barton, I understand you tended to Mr. Hamilton's injury. Yes, Sheriff. The bullet passed through his thigh. I cleaned and stitched the wounds. Good work, Dawson said with a nod of approval. Dr. Jenkins won't be back until tomorrow, but I'll send him out to check on Hamilton as soon as he returns. Of course. Mr. Hamilton is welcome to stay here until he's well enough to travel, Lillian said, glancing at Henry, who nodded his agreement. Appreciate that, Dawson replied. This is the 3rd stagecoach robbery in as many months, getting to be a real problem. After the sheriff and his deputies departed, promising to return the next day with the doctor, Lillian set about preparing a late supper for the exhausted ranch hands. Henry helped silently, moving around the kitchen with an ease that spoke of their growing familiarity with each other's habits. You did good today, Henry said quietly as they worked side by side. Not everyone would have handled an emergency like that so calmly. I'm just glad we could help, Lillian replied. It seems Mr. Hamilton will recover with time and care. Henry paused in slicing bread, turning to face her fully. Lillian, about what we discussed last night, your decision, I still have 2 days, she interrupted gently. And today has given me much to think about. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough, just know that after seeing you today, well, it only confirms what I already knew. You belong here, Lillian, at Silver Creek. The simple declaration, delivered without artifice or pressure, touched Lillian deeply. There was no denying that she'd felt more alive, more purposeful today than she had in months. The crisis had clarified something for her, the realization that she was needed here, that she had skills and strength to contribute. But was that enough reason to stay, to build a new life in the shadow of her old one? And what of her growing feelings for Henry Vance, feelings she wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge, let alone act upon? As they finished preparing the meal in companionable silence, Lillian found herself imagining a future at Silver Creek mornings in this kitchen, evenings on the porch watching the sunset, seasons changing across the vast landscape. It was a future far different from the one she'd planned with Thomas, yet somehow it no longer felt like a betrayal to consider it. Perhaps, she thought as she watched Henry move about the kitchen with his quiet strength, it was possible to honor the past while still embracing whatever the future might hold. The next 2 days passed in a blur of activity. Dr. Jenkins arrived as promised and pronounced Lillian's treatment of Hamilton's wound as fine a piece of field surgery as I've seen. The wounded man continued to improve, though he would need several weeks of recovery before he could travel. Lillian found herself too busy to dwell overmuch on her impending decision, though it was never far from her thoughts. By the evening of the final day of her agreed-upon month at Silver Creek, she had come to a resolution that felt right, if somewhat frightening in its implications. After supper, when the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse and Hamilton was settled for the night, Henry asked Lillian to join him on the porch. The evening was mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and the distant sound of Silver Creek rushing over stones. Beautiful night, Henry commented as they settled into the chairs that had become their habitual places for evening conversations. Yes, it is, Lillian agreed, her hands folded in her lap to hide their slight trembling. Henry was silent for a moment, his gaze on the darkening landscape. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. So, the month is up. Yes, Lillian said softly. It is. He turned to look at her then, his expression guarded yet vulnerable. Have you made your decision? Lillian took a deep breath, steadying herself. I have. I've decided to stay, Henry, at Silver Creek, if the offer still stands. The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable relief, followed by a quiet joy that transformed his features. It stands, he said, his voice rough with emotion. It will always stand, Lillian. There are conditions, she continued, needing to be clear. I'm still in mourning for Thomas. That won't change overnight. Henry nodded, his expression serious. I understand. I would never expect otherwise. And I need to maintain my own space, my independence. The cabin suits me well. Of course. Lillian hesitated, then forged ahead with the most difficult part. And we should be clear about what this arrangement is. I'm your housekeeper, Henry, nothing more. Even as she said the words, Lillian knew they weren't entirely honest. Her feelings for Henry had grown beyond mere friendship or employer-employee respect, but she wasn't ready to acknowledge that openly, not yet. Henry studied her face for a long moment before responding. For now, he said finally, his voice gentle but firm, you're my housekeeper for now, Lillian. But I won't pretend that's all I hope you might someday be to me. The candid admission sent a rush of warmth through Lillian. Henry, no, let me finish, he said, leaning forward in his chair. I respect your grief. I understand it in ways most couldn't. And I'll wait, Lillian, for as long as you need. Whether that's months or years, I'll wait. The sincerity in his voice, the patient understanding in his eyes, moved Lillian deeply. Why? She asked softly. You barely know me. Henry's expression softened. I know enough. I know you're strong and kind, brave when it counts, gentle when needed. He paused. And I know that since you came to Silver Creek, the ranch has felt like a home again, not just a place where I work and sleep. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. I'm not asking for promises, Lillian. Just the chance, someday, to see if what I feel for you might be returned. Lillian looked down at their joined hands, his large and work-roughened, hers smaller but equally marked by labor. There was something right about the sight, something that felt like possibility rather than betrayal. I can't make any promises, she said finally, meeting his gaze. Not yet, but I'm not opposed to the possibility. Someday. It was a small concession, but from the way Henry's expression lightened, it meant the world to him. That's enough for now, he said, gently squeezing her hand before releasing it. More than enough. They sat in companionable silence as full darkness settled over the ranch, each contemplating the tentative understanding they'd reached. For Lillian, it felt like the first step on a new path, one she hadn't chosen or expected, but which nonetheless seemed to be leading her forward into a future that held promise rather than just loss. I should check on Mr. Hamilton before turning in, she said eventually, rising from her chair. Henry stood as well. I'll walk you back to your cabin afterward, if that's all right. Lillian nodded, a small smile touching her lips. I'd like that. As they walked together into the house, Lillian felt a sense of rightness settle over her. Silver Creek had become more than just a temporary refuge. It had become a place where healing was possible, where purpose could be found, and where, perhaps, a new kind of happiness awaited. The weeks that followed Lillian's decision to remain at Silver Creek brought gradual but significant changes to her life. Mr. Hamilton recovered enough to travel after 3 weeks, departing with effusive thanks and a standing invitation to visit him in Denver, should she or Henry ever find themselves in the city. His presence had provided a welcome distraction during the initial adjustment to her new status as a permanent resident of the ranch rather than a temporary employee. Summer gave way to autumn, bringing with it cooler temperatures and the golden hues of changing leaves. The rhythm of the ranch shifted as preparations began for the coming winter, hay to be stored, cattle to be moved to lower pastures, supplies to be laid in from town. Lillian threw herself into these preparations, expanding the vegetable garden and preserving its bounty, mending winter clothing for Henry and the hands, and continuing to transform the main house into a true home. Her own cabin became cozier as well, with small touches that reflected her personality: books on the shelves, a quilt she'd pieced together during evening hours, wildflowers pressed between glass frames that Henry had crafted for her. Her relationship with Henry evolved slowly, respectful of her continued mourning. He never pressed for more than she was ready to give, content with their evening conversations on the porch, occasional shared meals, and the growing ease between them. Yet Lillian was increasingly aware of the way her heart quickened when he entered a room, the comfort she found in his presence, the way his rare, full smile could brighten even her darkest days. One crisp October morning, Lillian was hanging laundry behind her cabin when she heard the now familiar sound of Henry's approach, the steady footsteps, the occasional jingle of spurs. She turned to find him leading his horse, Thunder, already saddled. "Morning," he greeted her, his breath visible in the cool air. "Thought I'd ride up to check the north pasture fence before the weather turns. Was wondering if you might like to come along." Lillian hesitated. She'd ridden occasionally in her younger years, but hadn't been on a horse since before her marriage. "I'm not much of a rider," she admitted. Henry smiled. "Thunder's gentle as a lamb despite his name, and I'll be right beside you." The invitation was tempting. The north pasture was supposedly one of the most beautiful areas of the ranch, with views across the valley to the distant mountains. And the thought of spending the day with Henry, away from the watchful eyes of the ranch hands, held its own appeal. "All right," she decided. "Just let me change into something more suitable for riding." Henry's smile widened. "I'll saddle Daisy for you. She's the gentlest mare we have." Half an hour later they set out, riding side by side across the rolling grasslands of Silver Creek Ranch. Lillian was nervous at first, but soon found her confidence returning as Daisy proved to be as gentle as promised. The day was perfect for riding, cool enough to be comfortable, with a crystal-clear blue sky overhead and the scent of autumn in the air. "You're a natural," Henry commented as they crossed a shallow stream, Lillian handling the crossing with ease. She laughed, the sound carried away by the breeze. "Hardly, but Daisy is making it easy for me." "Horse and rider suited to each other," Henry observed, his gaze warm as it rested on her. "Important in all partnerships." The north pasture was everything Henry had promised and more. From its highest point, they could see for miles in every direction, the ranch buildings tiny in the distance, the creek winding like a silver ribbon through the valley, and the majestic Rocky Mountains rising on the western horizon. They dismounted to rest the horses, settling on a flat rock that provided a natural seat with a spectacular view. Henry produced a simple lunch from his saddlebags: bread, cheese, apples, and a canteen of water. "It's beautiful here," Lillian said as they ate, her gaze taking in the vast landscape. "I can see why you fell in love with this land." Henry nodded, his expression reflective. "First time I saw it, something just settled in me, like I'd been searching without knowing it and suddenly found what I was looking for." He glanced at her. "Haven't felt that way about much in my life." "The land and—" He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Lillian felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze. "Henry," she began, uncertain what she wanted to say, but feeling the need to say something. "You don't have to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I'm not pushing, Lillian. Just being honest about how I feel," she nodded, grateful for his understanding. "I care for you too," she admitted softly, "more than I expected to, more than I was prepared for." It was the first time she'd acknowledged her feelings so directly, and the simple confession seemed to hang in the air between them, significant and weighty. Henry's expression softened. "I'm glad to hear it, and I'll wait until you're ready for whatever comes next. No rush." They finished their meal in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they prepared to remount and continue their inspection of the fence line, Henry offered Lillian his hand to help her up. When she was settled in the saddle, he didn't immediately release her hand. "Thank you for coming with me today," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Seeing this place through your eyes, it makes me appreciate it all over again." Lillian squeezed his hand gently before letting go. "Thank you for showing it to me, for sharing something that means so much to you." The moment felt significant somehow, a quiet acknowledgement of deepening feelings and growing trust. As they rode along the fence line, checking for sections that needed repair before winter, Lillian found herself imagining many more days like this one riding beside Henry, sharing the work and beauty of Silver Creek, building a life together. The thought no longer filled her with guilt or confusion. Thomas would always hold a place in her heart, but she was beginning to understand that loving him didn't preclude opening her heart to someone new, different but no less real or meaningful. They returned to the ranch as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the land. The day had changed something between them, nothing dramatic or sudden, but a subtle shift toward a shared future rather than merely parallel presents. That evening, as they sat on the porch in what had become their nightly ritual, Henry reached for her hand, holding it gently as they watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. It was a small gesture, but significant, the first time he had initiated such contact outside of helping her mount or dismount, or steadying her on uneven ground. Lillian didn't pull away. Instead, she found herself turning her hand in his so their fingers could intertwine, a silent acknowledgement of the connection growing between them. Neither spoke of it directly, but as Henry walked her to her cabin later that night, there was a new awareness between them, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. At her door, Henry paused. "Good night, Lillian," he said softly. Then, with gentle deliberation, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Sleep well." The simple gesture sent warmth coursing through her. "Good night, Henry," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. As she readied for bed that night, Lillian found herself touching the back of her hand where his lips had pressed, remembering the warmth of his touch, the tenderness in his eyes. For the first time since arriving at Silver Creek, she removed her wedding ring, placing it carefully in a small box on her bedside table. It wasn't a rejection of her past, but an acknowledgement of her present and a tentative step toward her future. Winter arrived at Silver Creek with a suddenness that took Lillian by surprise. One day the air was crisp but mild. The next, snow began falling in earnest, blanketing the ranch in white. The change in seasons brought a different rhythm to ranch life, fewer outdoor tasks, more time spent in the warmth of the main house, preparing for the eventual spring. Lillian found herself enjoying the coziness of winter evenings, often spending them in the main house with Henry after the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse. They would sit before the fire, Lillian mending or knitting, while Henry read aloud from one of the books that had been gathering dust on his shelves until her arrival had prompted him to rediscover them. It was during one such evening in early December that Henry broached a subject that had been on both their minds. "Christmas is coming," he observed, closing the book they'd just finished. "I've never made much of it here at the ranch, just another day, mostly." Lillian looked up from the sock she was darning. "That seems a shame. Christmas was always special in my family, even after I married Thomas." Henry studied her face in the firelight. "Would you like to celebrate it properly this year? Might be nice for the men, too." "I would," Lillian admitted. "Though I'm not sure how elaborate we can be so far from town." "We could get a tree," Henry suggested, warming to the idea. "There's a stand of pines not far from here, and maybe arrange a proper Christmas dinner. Invite the McCullens, perhaps, and anyone else you'd like." The enthusiasm in his voice brought a smile to Lillian's face. "That sounds wonderful, though I should warn you, if we're having guests, this house needs curtains in the dining room and proper linens for the table." Henry grinned. "Then I suppose we'd better plan a trip to town soon." Can't have guests thinking Silver Creek doesn't know how to entertain properly. The next week brought their planned excursion to Promise Creek, the wagon loaded with supplies for the return journey. Winter had transformed the town, with snow piled along the boardwalks and smoke rising from every chimney. Christmas decorations adorned the storefronts, adding a festive air despite the cold. This visit was markedly different from Lillian's previous one. She walked beside Henry with confidence, her head held high, no longer concerned with the whispers that followed them. In the months since she decided to stay at Silver Creek, her position there had become accepted, if still occasionally gossiped about. Most importantly, Lillian herself had found peace with her decision. At Wallace's Mercantile, they selected fabric for new curtains, table linens, and a few modest decorations for the Christmas tree Henry had promised to bring back to the ranch. Mrs. Wallace was her usual inquisitive self, but Lillian handled her questions with good-humored deflection. "Planning quite the Christmas celebration, it seems," Mrs. Wallace commented as she wrapped their purchases. "First one at Silver Creek, isn't it?" "First one I've been part of, certainly," Lillian replied evenly. "Mr. Vance thought it would be nice for the ranch hands." Mrs. Wallace's knowing smile suggested she didn't entirely believe this explanation, but she merely nodded. "Well, it's good to see Silver Creek becoming a proper home at last. That place needed a woman's touch." Henry, returning from selecting a few additional items, caught the last of Mrs. Wallace's comment. "That it did," he agreed, his gaze warm as it rested on Lillian. "Fortunate for all of us that Mrs. Barton decided to stay." The simple statement, delivered in his deep, steady voice, brought a flush to Lillian's cheeks and a speculative gleam to Mrs. Wallace's eye. Lillian knew their exchange would fuel fresh gossip, but found she didn't much care. Let the town talk. What was growing between her and Henry was their business alone. Their final stop was at the Promise Creek Bank, where Lillian had business regarding the sale of her former home. She had finally found a buyer for the small house she'd shared with Thomas, and today she would sign the final papers. "Are you sure about this?" Henry asked as they approached the bank. "You don't have to sell if you're not ready." Lillian appreciated his concern, but her mind was made up. "I'm sure. The house has been sitting empty for months. It should belong to someone who will make it a home again." The transaction was straightforward, and when it was complete, Lillian felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The money from the sale would provide security for her future, whatever it might hold, and closing this chapter felt right. Her life was at Silver Creek now. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon for the return journey, soft snowflakes began to fall, adding to the Christmas atmosphere. Henry helped Lillian up to the seat, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Ready to head home?" he asked, his choice of words deliberate and meaningful. Lillian nodded, warmth spreading through her despite the cold. "Yes, let's go home." The days leading up to Christmas were filled with preparations. Henry and the men brought back a magnificent pine tree, which they set up in the main house's parlor. Lillian and Josiah's wife, Martha, who visited from her parents' farm where she and Josiah lived when he wasn't working at Silver Creek, spent an afternoon decorating it with paper ornaments, strings of dried berries, and small candles to be lit on Christmas Eve. New curtains were hung in the dining room, the table was extended to accommodate their expected guests, and the entire house was cleaned until it gleamed. Lillian found herself enjoying the preparations immensely, especially seeing how Henry's eyes lit up at each new transformation of his home. On Christmas Eve, a light snow fell, adding to the festive atmosphere. The McCullen family, Jim, Sarah, and their 3 children arrived in the afternoon, followed by Dr. Jenkins, who had become a friend since tending to Mr. Hamilton and Sheriff Dawson, who had no family of his own to celebrate with. The main house rang with conversation and laughter as everyone gathered in the parlor, where Henry had built a roaring fire. Lillian moved among the guests, serving mulled cider and the cookies she'd baked the day before, feeling a contentment she hadn't expected to find again after Thomas's death. As evening approached, Henry gathered everyone around the tree, which glowed with the light of a dozen small candles. "Before we sit down to supper," he said, his voice carrying easily in the suddenly quiet room, "I'd like to thank you all for sharing this Christmas with us at Silver Creek. Especially Mrs. Barton, whose idea it was to celebrate properly this year." All eyes turned to Lillian, who felt herself blush at the attention. It was hardly my idea alone, she demurred. Henry Mr. Vance was quite enthusiastic about it from the start. Henry's smile warmed as he looked at her. Perhaps we both needed a reminder that life is meant to be celebrated, even after loss. He raised his glass. To good friends, new beginnings, and the joy of the season. Hear, hear, echoed around the room as everyone drank to the toast. The Christmas dinner that followed was everything Lillian had hoped for, the table laden with roast turkey, potatoes, vegetables from her garden that she'd preserved for winter, fresh bread, and pies for dessert. Conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the occasional story from the ranch hands about their adventures throughout the year. Lillian, seated at one end of the table with Henry at the other, found her gaze repeatedly drawn to him throughout the meal. He seemed more relaxed, more openly happy than she'd ever seen him, laughing at Josiah's jokes and listening attentively to Sarah McCullen's news about her eldest son's engagement. As she watched him, Lillian realized with sudden clarity that her feelings for Henry had deepened into something she could no longer deny or dismiss. It wasn't just gratitude or friendship, but something more profound, a love different from what she'd felt for Thomas, but no less real or significant. The realization should have frightened her, but instead it brought a sense of peace. Perhaps this was what healing truly meant, not forgetting the past, but finding the courage to embrace a new future, complete with its own joys and possibilities. After the meal, as their guests gathered around the fire once more for coffee and conversation, Henry approached Lillian as she arranged dessert plates in the kitchen. "Everything's perfect," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. "You've given Silver Creek the best Christmas it's ever known." Lillian smiled up at him. "We did it together, that's what made it special." Henry's expression grew serious. "Lillian, there's something I've been wanting to give you, a Christmas gift, but I'd like to do it privately if that's all right." Curious, Lillian nodded. "Of course. Though I should warn you, I have something for you as well. Later then, after everyone's gone." He hesitated, then reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "Thank you for making my house a home again." The simple statement, delivered with such sincerity, touched Lillian deeply. "Thank you for giving me a place to belong when I needed it most." Their eyes held for a long moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Then, with a slight nod, Henry returned to their guests, leaving Lillian to gather her composure before following with the dessert. It was late when the last guests departed, the night clear and cold with stars sparkling overhead. Henry and Lillian stood on the porch, waving as the McCullens' wagon disappeared down the snowy drive, their lantern a diminishing point of light in the darkness. "Successful evening, I'd say," Henry commented, his breath visible in the cold air. "Very," Lillian agreed, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the chill. Everyone seemed to enjoy themselves. Henry turned to her, his expression softening. "Would you like your gift now, or are you too tired?" "Now, please," Lillian said, curiosity winning out over fatigue. "Though we should go inside before we freeze." Back in the warmth of the parlor, the fire now burned low, casting a gentle glow over the room. Henry gestured for Lillian to sit, then went to his desk in the corner, returning with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "It's not much," he said as he handed it to her, suddenly seeming nervous. "But when I saw it, I thought of you." Lillian carefully untied the string and unwrapped the paper to reveal a small wooden box, beautifully crafted with an inlaid design of wildflowers on the lid. Opening it, she found a delicate silver locket nestled on a bed of velvet. "Henry," she breathed, lifting the locket to examine it. "It's beautiful. Open it," he urged softly. Inside was a tiny, exquisitely detailed painting of Silver Creek, showing the main house, the creek, and the mountains beyond. On the opposite side was an inscription, "For Lillian, who brought light back to Silver Creek. With love, Henry." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes as she read the words. "With love" was both a traditional closing and something more significant, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing between them for months. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, looking up at him. Henry's expression was vulnerable yet hopeful. You don't have to say anything if you're not ready. I just wanted you to know how I feel, how much you mean to me. Lillian carefully set the locket back in its box, then rose to retrieve a package from beneath the Christmas tree. Your turn, she said, returning to hand it to him. Henry unwrapped it to find a leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with an image of a cattle brand, his cattle brand. Open it, Lillian echoed his earlier instruction. Inside, on the first page, Lillian had written, "For Henry, who offered shelter from the storm and found a way to heal two hearts in the process. With deepest affection, Lillian." Henry traced the words with his finger, his expression tender. "Deepest affection," he read aloud. "I thought about writing love," Lillian admitted softly, "but I wasn't sure if that would be presumptuous." Henry set the journal aside and took her hands in his. "Lillian, there's nothing presumptuous about it. I've been in love with you since, well, I can't even say when it started. It just grew day by day until I couldn't imagine Silver Creek or my life without you in it." The simple declaration, delivered in his deep, steady voice, filled Lillian with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire burning low beside them. "I love you too, Henry," she said, the words feeling both momentous and completely natural. "It took me by surprise. I wasn't looking for it, wasn't expecting to feel this way again after Thomas. But here we are." Henry's smile was radiant. "Here we are indeed." He hesitated, then asked softly, "May I kiss you, Lillian?" "I've been wanting to for months now." In answer, Lillian leaned forward, closing the distance between them. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened into something more passionate as months of restrained emotion found release. Henry's arms encircled her, drawing her closer, and Lillian found herself responding with an eagerness that might have shocked her once but now felt entirely right. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd find this again," he murmured. "After losing Elizabeth and Emma, I thought that part of my life was over." "I felt the same after Thomas," Lillian admitted, "as if grief was all that remained for me." She pulled back slightly to look into his eyes. "But you were right that day at the depot. Sometimes what's ahead isn't clear until we've weathered the storm." Henry smiled, brushing a tender kiss across her forehead. "And now, is it becoming clearer?" Lillian nodded, feeling a certainty she hadn't expected. "Yes. I see a future here at Silver Creek, with you." The joy that illuminated Henry's face at her words was answer enough, but he gave voice to it anyway. "That's all I want, Lillian, a future with you, whatever form it takes, whatever pace feels right to you." They sat together before the dying fire, talking softly of hopes and dreams, of fears overcome and possibilities ahead. It was well past midnight when Henry finally walked Lillian back to her cabin, their footprints marking a path through the freshly fallen snow. At her door, he kissed her again, a promise of more to come. "Merry Christmas, Lillian," he murmured against her lips. "Merry Christmas, Henry," she replied, her heart fuller than she'd thought possible again. "The first of many, I hope." "Forever with me," he said softly, echoing the promise he'd made that day at the depot, which now seemed both a lifetime ago and just yesterday. "For as long as you choose to stay." Lillian smiled up at him, snow catching in her eyelashes and on the shoulders of her shawl. "Forever sounds just about right," she said, and knew in her heart it was true. Spring arrived at Silver Creek with a burst of green across the winter-brown landscape, wildflowers dotting the meadows and new leaves unfurling on the trees. For Lillian, the season's renewal mirrored the transformation in her own life since that Christmas night when she and Henry had finally acknowledged their love for each other. Their courtship had progressed with a measured pace that respected Lillian's continued ties to her past while embracing their future together. Henry had been unfailingly patient, never pressing for more than she was ready to give, content to let their relationship deepen naturally. By tacit agreement, Lillian had maintained her separate residence in the foreman's cabin, though she spent most of her waking hours in the main house. The ranch hands observed the developing romance with quiet approval, especially Josiah, who had once confided to Lillian that he'd never seen the boss so happy. On a warm May afternoon, nearly a year after Lillian had first arrived at Silver Creek, Henry found her in the garden behind the main house, planting the last of the season's vegetables. He watched her for a moment, struck as always by the graceful way she moved, the care she took with each seedling. "Need a hand?" he offered, approaching from the porch where he'd left his boots to avoid tracking mud into her freshly planted rows. Lillian looked up, smiling at the sight of him. The past months had softened the lines of grief in her face, replacing them with the glow of contentment. "I'm nearly finished, but you're welcome to help with the watering." Henry took the bucket she indicated and began carefully watering the newly planted seeds. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the kind that comes from genuine comfort with each other's presence. "I was thinking," Henry said finally, setting the empty bucket aside. "It's a fine day for a ride, maybe up to the north pasture. The wildflowers are at their peak right now." Lillian sat back on her heels, wiping a strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "That sounds lovely. Give me half an hour to clean up." "Take your time," Henry replied, helping her to her feet. "I'll saddle the horses and pack a lunch." The north pasture was indeed spectacular, carpeted with wildflowers in every imaginable hue: blues, purples, yellows, and whites, creating a natural tapestry against the green grass. They rode to the high point that had become one of their favorite spots, with its sweeping view of the ranch and the distant mountains. After securing the horses, Henry spread a blanket on a flat area of ground and unpacked the lunch he'd prepared: cold chicken, bread, cheese, and early strawberries from Lillian's garden. They ate in companionable conversation, discussing ranch matters and plans for the summer ahead. As they finished their meal, Henry grew unusually quiet, his expression thoughtful as he gazed out over the landscape. "What is it?" Lillian asked, sensing something significant on his mind. Henry turned to her, his gray eyes serious yet warm with emotion. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us, about the future." Lillian's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Oh, what about it? Do you remember what I said to you that day at the depot, when I first asked you to come to Silver Creek? You said many things that day," Lillian replied softly. "But yes, I remember. You promised I wouldn't face life alone, not while I was with you." Henry nodded, reaching for her hand. "Forever with me, or for as long as you choose to stay. Those were my exact words." He paused, his gaze intent on her face. "I meant them then, and I mean them now, but I'm hoping you might be ready to make that forever a bit more official." Lillian's breath caught as Henry reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a ring, a simple band of gold set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "Lillian Barton," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "This past year has been the happiest of my life. You've brought light and warmth back to Silver Creek and to my heart. I love you more than I ever thought possible, and I want to spend the rest of my days showing you just how much." He took a deep breath. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled Lillian's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. The moment felt right, a natural progression of the love that had grown between them, a new beginning that honored rather than erased what had come before. "Yes, Henry," she said, her voice clear despite the emotion constricting her throat. "Yes, I will marry you." Henry's face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger, beside the wedding band from Thomas that she had begun wearing on her right hand several months earlier. The new ring fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "It was my grandmother's," Henry explained, his thumb gently caressing the pearl. "My father gave it to me before he died, said it should go to the woman who would share my life." He met her gaze. "I've been carrying it with me for weeks, waiting for the right moment." "It's beautiful," Lillian said, admiring the way the pearl caught the sunlight. "And this here, in this place that means so much to both of us, was the perfect moment." Henry drew her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke volumes of his love. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, a gesture that had become familiar and beloved over the months of their courtship. "When?" he asked simply. "Soon," Lillian replied, surprising herself with the certainty she felt. "Before summer's end, I think." "No need for a long engagement at our age," Henry laughed, the sound joyful and unrestrained. No need indeed, though we should probably have a proper wedding. The town would never forgive us if we eloped. A small ceremony, Lillian suggested. Here at Silver Creek, perhaps. On the porch of the main house or by the creek, wherever you want, Henry assured her. As long as at the end of it you're Mrs. Vance, I don't much care about the details. Mrs. Vance. The name sounded right to Lillian, a new identity that didn't erase her past but built upon it. Mrs. Henry Vance, she said softly, testing the sound of it. I think I'll wear that name proudly. They spent the remainder of the afternoon making plans for the wedding, for their life together afterward. It was decided that Lillian would move into the main house once they were married, while her cabin would be kept for guests or perhaps for a foreman, should they decide to hire one as the ranch continued to prosper. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the land, they reluctantly packed up their picnic and prepared to return to the ranch. Before mounting their horses, Henry pulled Lillian into one more embrace. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. "For what?" "For sitting on that depot bench a year ago, for taking a chance on a stranger and his crazy offer, for bringing life back to Silver Creek and to me." Lillian leaned back to look up at him, her heart full to bursting with love for this good, steadfast man who had found her at her lowest moment and offered not pity but possibility. "Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving that day," she replied. "For your patience, your kindness, your love." As they rode home side by side in the golden light of the setting sun, Lillian marveled at how far she had come from that grief-stricken widow on the depot bench. The path that had led her here had been unexpected, sometimes difficult but ultimately right. Silver Creek spread out below them as they crested the final hill, the main house, the barn, the bunkhouse, and her cabin, all bathed in the warm glow of evening light. Home in every sense of the word. The place where she had found not just shelter but purpose, not just work but belonging, not just healing but love, and beside her rode the man who had made it all possible with a simple promise made to a crying widow, "Forever with me." A promise that would soon be sealed before God and their community, binding their lives together officially as their hearts had already joined. As they approached the ranch, Lillian glanced at the engagement ring now adorning her finger, then at Henry's profile against the sunset sky. Their eyes met, and the love she saw reflected there confirmed what her heart already knew, that sometimes the greatest blessings come from the darkest moments, and that a life reborn can be every bit as beautiful as the one that came before. "Race you to the barn," Henry suggested with a boyish grin. Lillian laughed, the sound carrying on the evening breeze. "You're on." They spurred their horses forward, galloping the final distance home side by side, their laughter blending with the pounding of hooves against the earth, a joyful announcement of the shared journey that stretched before them, as vast and promising as the Colorado sky above. The wedding of Henry Vance and Lillian Barton took place on a perfect August day at Silver Creek Ranch, with the ceremony held on the wide front porch of the main house, and the reception spread across the yard beneath a canopy of blue sky. Wildflowers from the north pasture decorated every surface, their vibrant colors matching the festive mood of the occasion. Reverend Thompson from the Promise Creek Church officiated, his words about love born anew resonating deeply with the assembled guests who knew something of the journey that had brought the couple to this day. Lillian wore a gown of ivory silk, not white, in deference to her status as a widow, but not the somber colors of mourning either. It was a choice that acknowledged her past while embracing her future, much like the woman herself. Henry, standing tall and proud in a new suit ordered specially from Denver, watched with undisguised adoration as Josiah escorted Lillian across the yard to the porch steps. When asked later to describe how he felt in that moment, Henry would simply say, "Like a man who'd been given a second chance at happiness he never thought he'd find." The celebration afterward was joyous and unpretentious good food, music provided by local musicians, dancing on a wooden platform constructed by Henry and the ranch hands for the occasion. The entire town seemed to turn out, curiosity about the union long since replaced by genuine goodwill toward the couple who had found love in unexpected circumstances. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festivities, Henry and Lillian slipped away from the celebration to stand by Silver Creek, at the spot where they had shared so many important conversations during their courtship. "Happy, Mrs. Vance?" Henry asked, his arm around his new wife's waist. Lillian leaned into his embrace, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible again. "Completely, Mr. Vance," she assured him, "though I still can't quite believe we're here like this when I think of how we met." Henry's expression grew reflective. "I knew, that day at the depot, not that we'd end up married exactly, but that you were someone special, someone who would change my life if I let you." "And I thought you were merely being kind to a grieving widow," Lillian teased gently. "Little did I know you had ulterior motives." Henry laughed, the sound carrying on the evening breeze. "The only ulterior motive I had was keeping you from getting on that train. The rest, well, that was just Providence." Lillian nodded, understanding completely. There had been times in the past year when she'd felt Thomas's presence, not as a ghost or a haunting, but as a gentle acknowledgement of her right to find happiness again. She liked to think he would approve of Henry, of the life she was building at Silver Creek. "We should get back to our guests," she said eventually, though she was reluctant to leave the peaceful moment by the creek. Henry nodded, but before they turned to go, he drew her into a tender kiss. "Thank you for becoming my wife, Lillian Vance," he murmured against her lips. "For making Silver Creek truly a home at last." "Thank you for finding me when I was lost," she replied, her eyes shining with love, "for showing me that grief isn't the end of the story." Hand in hand, they walked back to the celebration, to the friends and neighbors who had gathered to witness the beginning of their life together. As they approached, Josiah called for attention, raising his glass in a toast. "To Henry and Lillian," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Two people who prove that it's never too late for a new beginning. May your years together be long and filled with joy." "To Henry and Lillian," echoed around them as glasses were raised in celebration. In that moment, surrounded by well-wishers and wrapped in her husband's embrace, Lillian felt a sense of homecoming more profound than any she had known before. Silver Creek was where she belonged, not because fate or tragedy had brought her here, but because love had given her the courage to stay. The years that followed brought changes to Silver Creek Ranch, each one a testament to the life Henry and Lillian built together. The main house expanded to accommodate their growing family, first with the birth of their son Thomas Henry in the spring following their wedding, then with daughter Eleanor Elizabeth 2 years later. Both children thrived in the freedom of ranch life, growing strong and confident under the watchful eyes of parents who cherished every moment with them. The ranch itself prospered as well. With Lillian's practical business sense complementing Henry's knowledge of cattle and land, Silver Creek became one of the most successful operations in the county. They added acreage, increased their herd, and even ventured into breeding horses under Miguel's expert guidance. Through it all, Henry and Lillian remained each other's strongest supporters and closest confidants. Their love, born in the aftermath of loss, grew deeper with each passing year, weathering the inevitable challenges of ranch life with the same steady strength that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting at the Promise Creek Depot, Henry surprised Lillian with a special gift, a bench he had crafted himself, placed beside Silver Creek at their favorite spot. Carved into the wood was a simple inscription, "Where two storms met and became a single path." "To remind us," he explained as they sat together on the bench, watching their children play along the creek's edge, "that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most beautiful journeys." Lillian leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full of gratitude for the life they had built together. "I never imagined that day at the depot that a stranger's kindness would lead to all of this," she said softly. "I was so lost in grief, so certain that my life was over." Henry's arm tightened around her. "And I never thought I'd find someone who could understand my losses, who could help me build something new without forgetting what came before." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching Thomas show his younger sister how to skip stones across the water's surface. At 7, he had Henry's height and Lillian's quiet determination. Eleanor at 5 was all energy and curiosity, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's gentle smile. "Do you ever wonder," Lillian asked thoughtfully, "what might have happened if I had gotten on that train that day, if our paths had never crossed?" Henry considered the question seriously before answering. "I believe some meetings are meant to be," he said finally. "Maybe not in the sense of divine intervention, but in the way that two people can recognize something in each other, even in the briefest encounter, that answers a need they might not have known they had." It was a philosophical response from a man who generally preferred actions to words, but Lillian understood his meaning perfectly. There had been something immediate in their connection that day at the depot, not love at first sight, perhaps, but a recognition of possibility, of shared understanding that transcended the brevity of their acquaintance. "Well, whatever forces brought us together," she said, turning to press a kiss to his cheek, "I'm grateful for them every day." Henry smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face and revealing the same dimple that now appeared in their daughter's cheeks when she laughed. "As am I, my love. As am I." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber, Henry and Lillian called the children to join them for the walk back to the main house. Hand in hand, with Thomas and Eleanor running ahead, they made their way along the familiar path, their footsteps sure on the land that had witnessed their journey from strangers to family. Silver Creek Ranch spread out before them, the house with lights beginning to glow in the windows, the barn where new life arrived each spring, the bunkhouse where loyal hands who had become like family resided, and beyond, the rolling grasslands and distant mountains that had called to both of them in different ways. It was everything neither had dared to hope for on that fateful day at the Promise Creek Depot: a home, a family, a love that had healed old wounds while creating something entirely new and precious. A testament to the truth that even in our darkest moments, possibility awaits if we have the courage to recognize it. "Forever with me," Henry murmured, echoing the promise he had made all those years ago as they approached the house that had become the heart of their shared life. Lillian squeezed his hand, her heart full of the love that had transformed a widow's tears into a life of unexpected joy. "Forever," she agreed, knowing it was both a promise and a reality already unfolding around them, day by day, year by year, in the life they had built together at Silver Creek.